speak to Andrew Smith, a senior lecturer in contemporary history and politics at the University of Chichester. Hello to you, Andrew. Listen, first question really is, why are the French people not as interested in the parliamentary elections?
Well, I think it's a difficult one, isn't it? As you say, there's an element of voter fatigue. We have, of course, a lot of campaigning for the presidential election, and a sort of weird period that has followed the presidential election, where it seems like politics has a little bit been in stasis, as Emmanuel Macron first of all put together a new cabinet, announced that, and it seems to have been sort of rumbling ahead and waiting until this election started. Often people aren't as enthused by the prospect of electing local representatives. It's easier to conceptualize and get behind the idea of who the president's going to be, the big figure. Much more difficult when you think about much kind of smaller constituencies, figures that you may not know as well, who may not be as well known in the media. And so it tends to follow really that you get far more older people turning out, far fewer younger people, those old truisms. And actually in this current election, it looks like that's the sort of thing that could favour Macron if that turnout is low. Of course, we've seen Macron trying to get a little bit out and get the vote out. We saw him on a walkabout yesterday in Clichy-sous-Bois, and of course, famously there, he was asked by a young girl, where is Mélenchon? And that's what a lot of posters are asking right now, because that is really the thing that's going to be the defining force in this election. Will people turn out for Mélenchon and NUPES, this new left alliance?
Yeah, I just want to clarify. You mentioned a low turnout could help the ensemble ruling coalition. But when we look at the far right, they have a very motivated base, don't they? I mean, you wouldn't think that the low turnout might help them instead.
Absolutely. So one of the difficult things is always in terms of the polls and projections is because of the specific way the legislative elections work. We can look at voting intentions, but as soon as we start to then project it into seats, it gets much more complicated. Of course, we need people to clear that 12.5% vote share to get into the second round of the election. Usually that means two candidates. But when you start to get the triangulars, when you get more than two candidates in that runoff, then things start to get very complicated and very difficult to predict. Now, as you mentioned, pollsters are looking right now for a much smaller level of return for the far right, the Rassemblement National. Really, it's looking at a kind of ceiling of around 55 seats. Now, that is much more than they have at present, but it's maybe not as much as people feared might come about really just immediately after the presidential elections. I think the big story has been the ascendance in terms of popularity and in the polls of this NUPES left alliance.
Yeah, so considering that, I mean, one of the main issues in April's presidential election was purchasing power, was the cost of living. That's carrying over, of course, into these parliamentary elections. Is NUPES doing better than the other parties in terms of trying to address prospective voters' needs or demands in that regard?
I think one of the key elements is to look at what NUPES is offering, as you say. And they've come together with this common programme. They're uniting the Socialists, the Greens, the France Insoumise as well, of course. And they're bringing together a range of promises which are largely targeting individuals, which seem to say very, very attractive things about, of course, the retirement age, about things like minimum wages and living standards across the board. And for many people, those are headline figures which will appeal. And I think that's one of the real reasons that we're seeing this big surge. Of course, we've seen left alliances before. This differs from maybe like the plural left that we saw under Jospin, because I think this has more of a grounding in kind of grassroots activism. And actually, that's where one of the interesting things might happen. That grounding in grassroots activism has drawn new people into politics in support of this left alliance, and it's where we might see some potential surprises. And there are people like Clément Beaune, of course, the kind of one of the favoured sons of En Marche, who has been, of course, Europe Affairs Minister. Now, he is a little bit under threat in the, I think it's the 7th district of Paris he's standing in. There's a lawyer standing for NUPES, Caroline Mécaré. Her kind of position looks much stronger. So there's a couple of interesting match-offs which might well see Macron's majority dented. And it is really because of that activism, that promise, that addressing those elements of everyday spending power, living conditions, and really talking to people where they are, I think.
All right, Professor, thank you very much for your time and your analysis. Andrew Smith from the University of Chichester.